So this is a follow-up video. To watch part 1, just look for this name, AMD and Intel. And being a follow-up video, I went ahead and kept the objective the same, so we're just looking for differences between these two. So first we're going to try to use some logic to figure out who really was the first to the x64 arena in terms of just x86 architecture. And then I'll just go through a list of these chips that came right before AMD's Opteron 64-bit chip. So in the last video we looked at this article, and the article's title is AMD brought 64-bit to x86 10 years ago. So the full title is important to realize. There might have been 64-bit before, like with Intel's Itanium. However, that was not working on top of the x86 architecture. And the importance of having 64 bits on top of x86 is so that those old programs, the 32-bit x86 programs, could still work, even though you're running them on a new processor. This first paragraph was particularly interesting. It says that the success of the Athlon K7 chip had AMD feeling pretty good about themselves, it looks like, and therefore the author of the article says that they are looking to take the fight to Intel by developing groundbreaking new features. But when I go down here, it says that AMD's Opteron chip was a 64-bit processor at a time when 64-bit processors were consigned to exotic silicon, meaning it was very rare, right? Apparently IBM's PowerPC was working with a 64-bit instruction set, so was Sun's Ultra Spark, and last but not least is that Intel Itanium I had mentioned before. And the article is calling that a lightning rod, as in that was the inspiration for AMD to use the Opteron here as a 64-bit while using the x86 underlying architecture as its base still. And that's why they're calling this 64-bit extension rather than just a 64-bit processor. Itanium was using a new radical instruction set, but it became an anchor around Intel's neck. Then it goes on to say that Intel dragged this anchor for decades, which fits with the Itanium's Wikipedia page, where it said it was produced from the mid-2001 time period to 2021. What? After I clicked on this link, I downloaded a PDF that's apparently a product change notification. I've never seen one of these before, and it's from Intel. And at the time of this video recording, it's April 5th, 2019. This came out in January. So there's just a lot of fine print down here, and right here it says that the products that are going to be affected is the Itanium 9740, 60, 50, and 20, as well as this C112 scalable memory buffer. I don't know what these are. So it's up here, last product discontinuance shipment date is 2021. Interesting. Another thing interesting about this Itanium chip is it looks like it was similar to this AMD chip I'll show you in a little bit, where you plug it in. Here's another better picture of it. Here's where connections are made, so there's a lot of pins, but they're not pins. Oh, okay, here on the other side you'll see the pins. Oh, here's an Intel Itanium socket. Maybe there's a lot of different types of Itanium chips. So this is the 9300. Here's the Itanium 2, MX2, Hondo, top and then bottom. Here's dual Itanium 2 processors. Itanium 2 in 2003 right here. And then going up to the first one we looked at, this is the Itanium Merst. Down here is the Itanium 2 McKinley. So going back to the article, it looks like Windows kind of screwed AMD over. They produced a Windows XP 64-bit edition. But the article then goes on to say this was nothing really more than just a beta OS, with the driver support being described as poor. It's definitely not something you want your OS to be known for. Now this paragraph particularly must hurt AMD. It says their Opteron chips and the whole 64 architecture helped x86 chips take on established server chip vendors such as IBM and Sun. This new architecture extension is beating them in performance, features, and software. However, it says here that the irony is that Intel took advantage of the AMD 64 architecture and ran away with the server market. Now, perhaps the greatest accolade for AMD was Intel's decision to license AMD 64 and rebrand it as x86 64 on its Xeon processors. Intel's decision to go with their technology, the AMD technology, instead of the IA-64 architecture served as an admission that Itanium and its complex instruction set were unsuccessful, so therefore I am wondering why so many Itanium processors are still out there. I just googled buy Itanium chip and there's a lot of interesting hits. It says here from the register, Intel to finally scatter remaining ashes of Itanium to the wind in 2021. Somebody on Super User asked, where are Intel Itanium chips used? The TLDR of the guy's answer says it was a big iron server chip that never sold well, and cheaper 64-bit Intel chips took much of its reason to be. Another guy answers by saying, they're pretty much exclusively found in server environments and not particularly often these days either. Oh, the end of the article is particularly interesting to me. It says, given Intel's dominant server market position, AMD's Opteron processor could be classed as a business failure. However, to judge Opteron simply on sales figures would be to do this firm a great disservice, as it is hard to find another launch that packed so many substantial innovations, so I totally agree with that, into one project. So they lost the battle, but maybe they can win the bragging war in terms of coming up with the best 64 architecture. Okay, so I hope I don't break your brain too much by going backwards in time, but let's look at some of the processors that AMD had developed before this Opteron was released. Starting with AMD's first in-house x86 processor, this was the K5 and it launched in 1996. Why kryptonite? Because this is a reference to Intel's hegemony over the market, as in like Intel ruled everything, so this K was supposed to be its kryptonite. And apparently around this time, the US Trademark and Patent Office said that Intel couldn't just call or trademark things by numbers, so since both AMD and Intel were working on 5th generation processors, Intel decided to call their version of the K5, I suppose, Pentium. Which Pentium originally derives from the Greek word penta, meaning 5. So I thought that was interesting, and here you go with a big look at the K5. And look at that, a whopping 75 megahertz. Well, up next in 1996, though I just read that K5 was 1996, it says in 96 AMD purchased Next Gen specifically for the rights to their NX series of x86 compatible processors. AMD gave the Next Gen design team their own building, left them alone, and gave them time and money to rework the NX 686. Oh, I get it. So in 96, AMD released K5 while beginning a new project that would result in K6. Which I'm learning, just because it was introduced in 97 doesn't necessarily mean it was released for sale in 97, but it was just simply introduced. So I guess I was smart on AMD's part to leave these next-gen guys alone, because they came up with the next processor AMD would be selling. And now I see apparently there's socket numbers, so it says the K6 was based on socket 7. But there's going to be some variants, such as the K6-3/450, which this particular chip apparently is faster than the Intel Pentium 2. And in parentheses here, Pentium 2 is the 6th generation processor, so AMD is making sense. K5 is for a 5th generation chip, K6 is for a 6th, but over here we have Pentium 2 because 6th generation. And if you're a little iffy on the whole concept of a socket, I guess there's a ton of different sockets out there that you can have on a motherboard, so go ahead and visit this website if you want to check out some of them. Well, I couldn't help myself. I went there so I could show you. Let's scroll down a little bit. So you got DIP, PLCC, PGA, socket 1. There's all the numbers we saw. Then the numbers go from socket 8 to 431 because that makes sense. Just like Windows going from Windows 8 to Windows 10 makes sense, and Apple i8, or I should say Apple 8 phones went to Apple X or 10 phones. Ah man, who is in charge of numbering things in the technology world? So here you go with all the different types of sockets that apparently you can use with chips. Okay, so next up is the K7. This was AMD's 7th generation x86 chip. Came out in 1993, and at this time it's going to begin using this name Athlon. So if we think back to that article we were reading, it said the Athlon series was pretty good. So Opteron was the logical next step for chips for AMD. Now K7 really stirs things up because these are really weird looking chips. They cannot be used on the same motherboards as Intel ones, all because there were some licensing issues. So here's what we get when businesses collide. And when you plug this bad boy in, it's going to be plugged into something apparently called the alpha processor bus. And check this out, it looks really strange. So there it is, plugged into the motherboard there. Looks like we have the same motherboard, a different view right there. And here's the part I really start getting confused with. I thought the Opteron was the first 64-bit chip, but down here it says a high-speed 64-bit system interface. So that's something for me or you and us to go ahead and learn at a later date. So let me wrap up the K7 chip by saying it's not the K7 as in the mountain range. Well, the mountains in the Karakoram range. Each peak has its own number, so the K7 peak is 6,934 meters into the air. And if you ever think about this, for some reason I do, that when you go from K7 to K2, you're going higher up apparently, and this is 28,000 feet. For the people who live in Colorado Springs with me, we all know that Pikes Peak is a pretty large mountain, and that is large to us at only 14,000 feet, I think. Definitely not even close to this K2 peak. So back on topic, here's our last one to look at. The K8 was a major revision of the K7 architecture. This K8 was released in 2003, with the most notable features being the addition of a 64-bit extension. So even though we just saw on that other website, unless that website was incorrect, K8 is the first time we're looking at a 64-bit extension. And now this makes a lot more sense in the context of the Itanium being a server-specific type of chip, and our K8 here is like the world's first regular desktop-looking x86 64 chip. Oh, this is how it works. So AMD Opteron is the name of a processor family, meaning there are several different types of Opteron chips, starting with Sledgehammer, aka our K8 chip, in 2003. Now when I scroll down and click list of AMD Opteron microprocessor, it gives us some interesting information. I think just the contents helps us the most. So K8 was the first Opteron type chips. And you go through this like 100 series Sledgehammer, 200, 800, then we get into, I guess, Venus chips, then a Troy, Athens, Denmark. Almost seems like there's no rhyme and reason to these naming conventions. But how cool is that? You got Pile Driver based Opterons, Jaguar based Opterons. These names are just so crazy. And here's some interesting specs, so you'll get a release price here, along with speeds and voltage stuff, so just an interesting find. So that's the end of the lesson. Just try to answer this DOL, summarize all your new learning by answering this question. What new facts can you say separate AMD from Intel?